Okay, hi everyone. So sorry for that technical difficulty. Hopefully, we'll have some more people finding this new link and being able to roll in. But we're just going to get started so that we don't lose time, and we are recording so people can watch this once they finally get the link. So, my name is Kelsey. I am the founder and executive director of Willow International. We're an trafficking organization in East Africa. I'm also a PhD student at UC Irvine researching human trafficking in the School of Social Ecology. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited about this topic, and I'd love to hear from you and have this be as participatory as possible for Zoom. So I'm going to open up my chat box so I can see your questions, your comments. If you can, please, you can start by just letting me know where you're joining us from and maybe who you are. Are you a student, a practitioner? What brought you to this talk today? I'd love to hear from you. You can also submit your questions in the chat. I will try to get to those questions while we are going. If not, we'll address them at the end. So I have been working in the anti-trafficking sector for 11 years now and have put a lot of time and thought into this issue of re-victimization. So a large portion of funding, messaging, and interventions in the anti-trafficking movement are dedicated towards rescue. But how do we know that those rescue efforts are helping survivors on the long run? What happens after the rescue? Are survivors getting the support that they need to recover from exploitation, reintegrate back into society, and go on to lead full, healthy lives? What about their children and the families of those who have been trafficked? How are they doing? How are we supporting the families of child survivors? Are we including them in our conversations and in our interventions? So unfortunately, there's little research out there, but the research out there does say that re-trafficking is happening at alarming rates, which says that people are getting stuck in cycles of abuse and exploitation. And today we're going to dive into some of the reasons behind that and find some potential solutions for stopping these cycles and preventing re-victimization. My experience primarily is with trafficking in the developing world and not locally. So our conversation today is going to have a more global perspective. However, I did include domestic research into the presentation. In preparing this talk, I solicited the support of my organization's Survivor Advisory Committee to share their feedback and their ideas. While research is vital, it's also important that we listen to survivor voices. And I love this quote from Amy Ray, which says, "Without listening to the voices of those we're seeking to help, we cannot serve them with the dignity and the humanity that they deserve." And this sounds so simple, but unfortunately, it's not being done with many organizations in the anti-trafficking space. And so if we're going to improve outcomes for survivors, we can't do so if we don't listen to them. So let's dive in. So to talk about cycles of abuse and exploitation, we need to begin with the vulnerabilities that led to that exploitation in the first place. This data is from the recently released UNODC report taken from nearly 3,000 case files of victims from 71 countries. And it looks at the percentage of case by pre-existing factors that traffickers have taken advantage of. And as you can see, the number one pre-existing factor is economic need, followed by being a child with a dysfunctional family. Does anything on here stand out to you? To me, in my experience, we're seeing an increase in referrals to our organization of victims with cognitive and physical disabilities. The traffickers are specifically preying on those vulnerabilities and targeting them, using them for exploitation. Next, we have a report from World Without Exploitation, and what they have done is gather information from a variety of different domestic studies here in the United States for pre-existing factors for sexual exploitation. The number one that we see here is a history of childhood abuse and neglect, so prior abuse, and this is consistent across all of the research. It is well known that the majority of sex trafficking victims in the US were in the child welfare system. And this research also reports that. We also see things like homelessness, having run away from home, a history of sexual abuse from a family member. All of these are pre-existing factors that made individuals vulnerable to trafficking. So what happens to all these vulnerabilities that we've just looked at after a victim is rescued? Well, in most cases, those vulnerabilities do not go away, but are in fact intensified. Many survivors and their families, in fact, paid money in order to follow an economic opportunity that turned out to be trafficking. Others have debt that remains from their trafficking. So at a minimum, their economic situation is the same, but usually it's much, much worse. Many survivors also share that the trauma from their childhood is the primary source of their pain, that trafficking is not the primary trauma, but the result of a series of traumas. So without addressing these issues and healing those wounds, survivors are likely to end up being re-victimized. So from the research, I want to talk through some of the factors that have emerged through research that lead to re-victimization. The first is haphazard repatriation. This means that victims are often rescued and repatriated without being provided aftercare services. And I've seen this in my work time and time again. An organization will rescue a victim from a trafficking situation in a country, either a transnational or a domestic case, and put them back into society or on a plane back home without ensuring that they have adequate quality aftercare services to support them. And without the support to address those vulnerabilities that led to trafficking through an agency or an organization, the survivors are likely to end up re-trafficked simply trying to survive. For example, they may be offered a job in another country when they get back home that they think, well, if this happened to me in country number one, it's not going to happen in country number two. And they take that risk because they're so vulnerable. Survivors also share a great deal about the stigma they face in their communities when they return home. That stigma often leads to isolation, contributes to low self-esteem, and makes them vulnerable again. Debt bondage and economic pressure to provide for the family are also key factors. Many victims take out loans or their families sell land or animal in order for the victims to access opportunities. The trafficker, who they don't know that is their trafficker at that point, provides an opportunity and says, hey, I need $500 to process your passport and your visa and to get all this together for you so that you can have a job and it's going to lift your family out of poverty. You're going to be wealthy. Look at me. But none of that ends up to be true. And so when the survivor returns, not only did the individual and likely their family lose money, take out loans, or sell land, but they had expectations that the survivor would then lift them out of poverty, that this was going to be their one shot to finally put food on the table, send kids to school, etc. And so the families are upset when the victims come home. And when you pair that with the stigma of what they've been through, especially if it's sexual exploitation, they don't feel like they can share what happened with their families. And so they end up taking new risks in order to find economic opportunities to support their family. The number one protective factor to prevent abuse, according to research, is social support, having a social support system. Stigma, social marginalization, and lack of access to support services leave many survivors without this protective factor and thus vulnerable to re-victimization. And though we've made some great strides increasing trauma-informed approaches in the justice sector, this is an area that still needs a ton of improvement across the world. A human rights approach to justice focuses on the victim of the crime as a person whose rights have been violated, as opposed to a criminal justice approach, which focuses on punishing the perpetrator of the crime. A human rights approach values the victim first and addresses the criminal justice issue second. And that would be asking the survivors, what does justice look like to you? So, as I said, we approached our Survivor Advisory Committee to speak into this presentation today and to share from their experience what the factors are that lead to re-victimization. Number one was cultural norms and practices. Some of these cultural norms include women often not being equal. So gender inequality, women being treated like property, women commonly being blamed when they are sexually abused or exploited, women being stigmatized and labeled by their family. So say you've been victimized by sex trafficking, being labeled as a prostitute. Um, and that's really difficult when survivors are trying to reintegrate back into family and community. They're afraid that they're going to find out what happened to them and they're going to suffer from that stigma. There's also family pressure to provide economically. Lack of prevention education. So our survivor advisory, they describe this as living in denial. So just because a survivor was trafficked to one country, they may get home and hear of another opportunity that's risky, but they're not aware that those are also red flags and risks of trafficking. And so we need to focus on providing prevention education, not just to vulnerable people, but also to survivors so that they are not re-victimized. Peer pressure can be huge, especially in the developing world. There's a desire to lift families out of poverty, to go to a new status, and that peer pressure can often lead to re-victimization. Many survivors are not identified as victims of trafficking, and they often face criminal charges or are deported from the country they've been trafficked to without a victim status, which prevents them from accessing services, which allows them to fall back into this cycle of abuse and exploitation. Debt burden, as we discussed, is an issue brought up commonly in research. Even after they've been rescued, that debt doesn't go away. And if survivors are able to access services, they often are given high expectations and promised a lot by service providers that they can't always meet. And that leads to re-victimization as well. So I wanted to give a case study of Monica, her story. So Monica was trafficked to Thailand and forced into commercial sexual exploitation for 2 years. When she was repatriated back to Uganda, she joined our community-based aftercare program. Her son was staying with an uncle. She had him go there before she left. And before she left, she promised that she would send money home to care for her son and to pay for his school fees. She also borrowed money from her family so that her trafficker could process her passport and her visa. When she was rescued and she returned, her family was so upset with her. They had expected money when she was away, and it put a huge burden on them to take care of her son. And she felt that pressure, she felt that stigma, and she felt so much pressure to look for an opportunity to go abroad so that she could reconcile with her family. She expressed her concerns to a friend, and a friend shared, hey, there's an opportunity to make money in Saudi Arabia as a hostess working at a hotel. The friend seemed to be well off, dressed in nice clothes, and even had a car. And so although it sounded similar to what was offered to her before, she thought that in this country, things were going to be different. And she communicated to her caseworker that she was planning to go abroad again. This story is a great example of a lot of the issues that we just discussed. Some of the practical things our organization did to prevent re-victimization in this case were as follows. 1, we provided a scholarship to the child to meet that immediate need of getting him to school. 2, the survivor attended our survivor support group so that her peers could share their experiences and help mitigate that stigma and shame that she was feeling. 3, our counselors provided individual and family counseling in a survivor-led way to resolve the family issues and repair those relationships. 4, the survivor enrolled in an economic empowerment program and was given capital to start a small business so that her immediate need of providing for herself and her child could be met. And 5, we provided long-term follow-up care so that the survivor had an ongoing social support through peers, caseworkers, and counselors. In addition to getting feedback from survivors in our program, I also asked our staff to give feedback on behalf of the children that they work with. And here's some additional factors that stood out for child survivors. 1, there's little support in most organizations given to the families of survivors. As we saw in the UNODC report, economic need is the top vulnerability. So there's a need to support the families of survivors so that they can support their children. So they're not desperate and vulnerable to re-victimization. Lost years of education can also hinder the recovery process. Though a survivor may wish to complete formal education, it's not always an option based on what her education looked like before and how long she was victimized. We have to find creative solutions to help survivors identify educational and career options that are attractive to them and are in line with their skill sets and their goals and their desires. We've seen also problems arising from threats from traffickers and delays in justice. These threats cause survivors to run away from the aftercare programs. Delays in justice make survivors lose hope and feel like there's no point in continuing with their services. One of the questions we got in advance of this was, how has COVID-19 impacted this issue? And that is one of them. The justice sector had huge delays, and I have a whole slide on COVID-19 that we will get to. Organizational dependency is also a huge issue. So many organizations have this desire to care for survivors forever, and they make false promises. And the reality is that we have to find safe and healthy communities and families for survivors to reintegrate into, so that those safe family members and community members can be that social support network to mitigate those risks. And organizations need to have this in mind from the beginning of service provision. I see this happening especially a lot with the church and with Christian service providers, that we want to hold on to these survivors instead of allowing them to go back and reintegrate into community and supporting the development of safe and healthy relationships. So I want to give an example of another case study. So this is Sheila, not her real name, her story. Sheila was a child victim of sex trafficking. Her family was promised that if they sent their daughter away, she'd be given an education and shelter and food. Her family was desperate. They had recently lost a child due to starvation. And while Sheila escaped her trafficker and received aftercare services, the economic status of her family never changed. If she was going to be repatriated as things were, her family communicated that the only option they felt that they had was to risk sending her away again to another opportunity in order to keep her alive, because they couldn't afford to feed her. So in order to help Sheila, we have to help her family. And so this is taking a broader look at our interventions. And COVID-19 has only increased these vulnerabilities. And here's what we've seen in our work. Increased economic vulnerability due to the lockdowns and the economic collapse that's happened as a result of COVID-19. A lot of COVID-19 was very triggering for survivors and increased their vulnerability. There was an increase of intimate partner violence, which forced many survivors to leave their homes and make risky decisions in order to escape a violent home. Victims were unable to be repatriated. So as we speak, there are still many, many people trapped in foreign countries, unable to return home. And they're now being re-exploited and they're being taken advantage of because of this vulnerability. There's also health complications, difficulty lacking health services. Many survivors of trafficking have health complications like their HIV status, which make them at high risk of complications due to COVID-19. Social isolation was also a huge one, increasing vulnerability. Closure of shelters and aftercare services, and new recruitment tactics have emerged that survivors and organizations just weren't prepared for, including increases in online recruitment in the developing world. The delays in criminal proceedings and decrease in funding for anti-trafficking programs. So in addition to the challenges that victims face, there's also sector challenges that need to be addressed. First, we have a systemic problem of not listening to survivors and including them in our interventions, prevention, and marketing strategies. Gosh, there have been so many great talks about this at the conference so far. I encourage you to go listen to Kathy's section and what Bella shared. There's also a lack of sufficient funding that has only been exacerbated by COVID-19. There's a disproportionate focus on rescue, both in our communication strategies and what is getting funded. And this is doing a disservice to the sector. We need to ensure survivors have access to quality services, and that word quality is key. and access to economic opportunities, job, education, training, etc. Prevention of trafficking and re-trafficking need more attention both in research and in interventions so that programs can be more effective. And one of the big ones that I've seen is a deficit-based approach to our interventions. We need to empower survivors by building on their strengths and building on who they are versus re-exploiting them through our messaging and focusing too much on victimhood and trauma. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be trauma informed. We need to be trauma informed. We need to be victim centered. But we also need to ensure that we're strength based from the beginning, from our intakes. We need to be identifying what the strengths are and building upon those strengths so that from even our intakes, we are building self efficacy and self esteem. All right. A couple more sector challenges here. We lack cross-sector collaboration, so we need more intervention from the private sector. We need to focus more on prevention efforts. We need to support families. Goodness, Judge Maria Hernandez's talk was so amazing. How can we support people who have been involved in the criminal justice sector? We just need to take a more holistic approach to trafficking. Voices from, sorry about that, let me go back. So I've given you a ton of information about what the problems are. So now let's talk about what we can do about it. We have to understand the issue first. Dr. Sandy Morgan always talks about that. Understand it first, listen to the survivors, and hear what they have to say in terms of how we can prevent re-victimization. So this was gathered from our Survivor Alliance. The first thing that they said is providing quality psychosocial support and counseling, and doing so from a holistic perspective. The next was providing and supporting their educational and economic empowerment. So that is addressing that underlying economic vulnerability. This can be done through partnerships and through engaging in the private sector as well. So for example, our organization has multiple partners who provide employment to survivors, who provide job training and economic empowerment. So we don't all have to be experts at everything. We need to collaborate across sectors to improve access to survivors to the support services that they need. And this should include supporting the families of survivors, as well as supporting the children of survivors. So often victims, children, if they're not supported, end up trapped in the cycle of exploitation as well. And so we need to support the children of survivors. Long-term follow-up is also key. Too often survivors are reintegrated and left to fend for themselves after they've graduated from like a residential aftercare program. And yet they'll tell you that returning home is incredibly triggering and challenging. And they often need a lot of support in that first few months, up to a couple of years after they've reintegrated back into community. And so our interventions need to include that long-term follow-up. Giving survivors a sense of belonging. Oh, I love this one. And if you participated in one of the plenaries yesterday where we heard Bella talk, she talked about her church was that community that gave her a sense of belonging. But how can we support developing community and belonging as individuals and as organizations? What partnerships can we develop? What programs can we implement? How can we help survivors learn how to identify healthy and safe relationships so that they can develop those and have those relationships long term? We need to implement programs that develop self-esteem and self-efficacy. So organizations need to identify that they can create dependency and address that in their programming from day one. Goodness, one of the things that we learned early on is we had the government come and assess the safety of our shelter. And they said, wow, you need to be careful what your shelter even looks like. Because when the survivor goes home, they're going to get used to what they had at the shelter, and their home isn't going to look like this. And so you don't want them to have this dependency on you. You want to make sure that they are going to be safe and feel comfortable with their families and with the type of living environment that they're used to from their homes and what it's going to be like when they reintegrate. We need to do prevention work with families and communities so that they can recognize the signs. Like I showed earlier before, just because someone was trafficked once doesn't mean that they can't be coerced or manipulated in a different way. It doesn't mean that the children can't be coerced and manipulated. So we have to equip survivors and their families with prevention education as well. One of the amazing things about that is we've seen survivors go back into their communities and prevent trafficking from happening. I've heard so many stories of survivors who've gone on, opened up small businesses, and they're employing vulnerable girls in their community who they saw were at risk of being trafficked. One of the survivors actually overheard someone trying to recruit a young woman and intervened and told her story and prevented that young girl from being trafficked. So not only can we equip them with prevention work for themselves, but they can go on to be advocates in their communities. And job placement and economic opportunities, this is huge. And the research just says time and time again that our interventions are lacking this, that we need to ensure that we address those economic vulnerabilities. So some additional recommendations from research and from my staff include, like we discussed earlier, a human rights and victim-centered approach to the criminal justice process, providing support to the family members, gaining a comprehensive understanding of the survivor's needs and well-being upon intake, and doing so in a way that develops self-efficacy and builds on strengths. So setting tangible goals from the beginning and celebrate successes. So not focusing on what they don't have, focusing on what they have, their inherent strength, who they are. Maybe they have an auntie who was there for them that they can rely on, building upon the strengths that they do have so that the process isn't so overwhelming, so that they learn to identify what their strengths are and build upon those. And then continue following up and supporting families. Yes, some families traffic their children, traffic their adult children, some doing it knowingly, but others do it not knowingly. Others are not involved at all. So we can't assume that all families are bad. If we find that a family is safe, that a family was not involved in the trafficking, how can we wrap around that family? How can we support that family so that the child can return home and not be vulnerable there? So this is a lot. I want to summarize kind of the key things that I've taken from my experience and from the research that I've read, and summarize it into something that you can easily take away. So number one, address the vulnerabilities that led to trafficking, whatever those are in your context. It's going to look different for me than it's going to look for someone working in another country or here domestically, but we need to address what those vulnerabilities are for the individual and within the context that we're working. We need to create and support opportunities for belonging and social connection. Always think back to that. Number one protective factor is providing that social safety net. And that's there, it's going to mitigate a whole ton of risk and re-exploitation. And I've seen it time and time again. One thing that we say in our organization is if a graduate of our program reaches out after for help, we see that as a success. We don't see that as them failing. We see that as we've developed those relationships so that they feel safe in reaching out to us. They feel safe saying, hey, I was offered this job in Saudi Arabia. What do you think? Should I take it? Or, hey, I'm in a domestic relationship that's turning violent. Can you help me? What can I do? That's a win. And that's not only for a role for organizations to play, that's a role for the church to play. That's a role for us to play as individuals with everyone in our life, to be that social support, to be that safe person in someone's life. You're going to mitigate a whole slew of potential abuses and exploitation. Providing long-term follow-up care. We have to be in it for the long run. If you talk to survivors anywhere in the world, they're going to say, you got to be in it. You can't be there for just a couple months and leave their life. You need to be committed. If you're going to jump into this work, you got to be in it for the long haul. Provide comprehensive restorative care services. This is the whole gamut. It's economic empowerment, it's education, it's quality psychosocial support. We do a trauma healing yoga program in our work. It's understanding what survivors need, listening to their voices, and implementing interventions that are helpful. Taking a strength-based approach, so building on strengths, building on skills, focusing on goal setting, and cross sector collaboration. So if you're listening to this talk and you own a business, what can I do? Figure it out. How can your company employ survivors? How could you inform and spread awareness to the general public? There is a way for everyone to get involved in this fight, and we need that cross-sector collaboration to be effective. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen there and turn it over to questions. So Desiree, if you want, I don't know if any questions have come in, but I will let you take it from here with the questions. And I will look at the chat now to see.
Yeah, so everyone watching, if you have any questions, now is the time to ask. And I'd love to, and I know Kelsey would also love to hear any questions that you guys have or any comments. But maybe while you're thinking about that, I'll go ahead and start us off and ask you a question. So you mentioned a couple times holistic care in that talk around holistic, and I've heard that a few times regarding conversation around anti-trafficking. So I'm just wondering if maybe you would break down a little bit specifically what holistic care looks like, and maybe what the difference is or why that is so important specifically with holistic.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And so holistic takes a holistic approach, looks at the whole being. It looks at their health, so their physical health, and addresses how do we care for the survivors' health. Taking them, what we do is first step, take them to an initial medical exam. Get them assessed, make sure that their healthcare needs are addressed, and both meeting their immediate needs, their long-term needs, and preventative needs as well. It's looking at their psychosocial well-being, so their mental and emotional health, and providing services that address that. It's looking at their physical safety. Do they have housing? Do they have access to healthy food, drinking water, hygiene materials? So looking at those physical needs that they have. And that may look like providing residential shelter, or it may look like linking them up with housing. It looks at their education and their economic empowerment. So ensuring that they can provide for themselves and their families, that they're empowered to pursue their goals and their dreams. Their legal status. So if they're identified as a victim of a crime, they may have a case. If they are trafficked transnationally, there may be immigration issues, visas that they need support with. So providing them that legal aid and legal advocacy that they need. Family tracing and support. So with children, often for us, that looks like helping identify safe and healthy family members for them to reintegrate into, and then providing counseling services and support to that family, preparing them to take the survivor back in after they've gone through a program. Often this includes spiritual support as well, no matter what religious background they're coming from. Many survivors are trying to figure out how to reconcile that relationship with God, whoever God is to them. And it looks like supporting them in that process, meeting their spiritual needs, ensuring that they have access to worship freely as they want to, or to go to church. You know, I've heard horror stories of shelters. They lock people up and they don't allow them to access the things that feed their souls, or they force religion on them that's not the religion that they wanted. And so it looks at the being as a whole being. It looks at all of their needs. There's different theoretical frameworks that we can refer to, but really think about everything that you need, all the things that you needed, and it's all encompassing. Thank you.
That's so good. Thank you for answering. That's such helpful information for everyone to know when it comes to anti-trafficking and just the part we can all play when it comes to just caring for others in this. There's a comment in here from Rachel, and it says, I really love the strength-based approach. You talked about how economic hardships are a big risk factor. What are some suggestions or programs for helping provide financially for families in poverty?
Such a good question, Rachel. And I see that you're joining us from Brazil. So that's fantastic. I'm not sure what resources are available to you in Brazil, but here's a couple of the things that we've done. One, we have partnered with organizations that focus on economic empowerment. One of those organizations is called Street Business School, and they provide a 6-month training program that helps survivors build entrepreneurial skills. And then we provide startup capital so that they can start small businesses. One of the cool things about this program is we provide ongoing mentorship. So it's not just like, here you go, start a business, you're on your own. It's ongoing support. And that I could imagine something like that would probably work well in Brazil. We've also identified organizations who will employ survivors. One of those is International Sanctuary, and we work with another organization called the Market Project. They provide actual employment and job skills training, like on the job skills training, so that they don't need to be employed by that organization forever, but could get the skills that they need. It's like a transitionary job to go on and get other jobs in the formal sector. Other practical things that we do are we provide vocational training scholarships. So we identify what the survivors, what their skills are, what their interests are, and then we give them a scholarship to go through. Usually it's about a 1-year training program, and then they graduate with the skills that they can then go on and find a job. It's important to note that if you're going to do something like this, you have to ensure that the survivor is catered for economically while they go through the program. And so for us, that often looks like living in one of our residential programs. If they're in our community-based programs, we need to make sure that they have stipends and are able to get food, able to pay for rent while they go through their training program. And we also, like I think I mentioned earlier, we provide scholarships for children of survivors, especially while they're going through this training and getting back on their feet economically, because that's a huge driver of trafficking is people just want to be able to educate their children and care for their children. So we want to make sure that we meet that need so that they aren't at risk of re-victimization.
So good, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? If not, then we'll be closing up for now, but
There was one question in the comments on the app I wanted to get to. It asked how COVID affected exploitation. I think we covered that. It also asked if it made it easier for people to be exploited. And I would say yes, but I would say that it's changing. And so for a time period, because borders were closed, yes, trafficking was still happening across borders, but we saw a bit of a decrease in transnational trafficking, though we saw lots of victims stuck abroad. We saw a lot of trafficking moving online, a lot of recruitment online, and we've seen the cases get worse and worse. So we're seeing, at least in our case, domestic trafficking increasing, domestic sex trafficking increasing. And the research is showing that because of the economic crisis, that there is an even greater demand for cheaper labor. And that there's a lot of people willing to take risky jobs, migrate in a risky way. And so, yes, it's made it a lot easier for people to be exploited. And I think we're going to see the effects of COVID for years and years to come with this population. So thank you all so much. We're so sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning, but thank you for finding your way here. It was a joy to get to share with you today. And if you want to reach out, my email and all my contact information is in the app, so feel free to stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. This was amazing. The presentation so informative. Thank you so much for being here and for helping us learn today. And thank you everyone for joining us. Apologies for the technical difficulties. But just want to update you guys on where we are with the agenda today. So we're going to be going into a break until 2:15, and then the next segment of the conference will start at 2:15, just to let everyone know. But thank you so much again for being here, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Bye.